A widow's ring, a man's disguise, and Holmes chasing shadows in the fog. Welcome to Detective Noir. I am your host, Daniel Mercer. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your voices make this journey special. Now let's begin. It was a wet and disagreeable November evening when the events I'm about to recount began, an evening painted in slate grays and streaked with the fine mist of drizzle that had settled like a shroud over London. Baker Street was unusually quiet, and the only sounds to be heard were the sporadic clip-clop of hooves on damp cobblestones and the occasional hiss of a gas lamp catching the fog. Sherlock Holmes had not spoken in nearly an hour. He sat cross-legged in the armchair opposite mine, the fingertips of both hands pressed together in that characteristic pose that suggested deep, impenetrable thought. The remains of his untouched supper lay beside him, while the heavy drapery of our sitting-room window kept the dim world outside at bay. Holmes' gaze was fixed not on me nor the fire, but some distant abstraction only he could see. For my part, I was reading a rather uninspiring medical review, half-heartedly, I confess, when the silence was broken by the firm clang of the front doorbell. "Mrs. Hudson is out," Holmes murmured without moving. "She went to her sister's in Brixton this afternoon, and the maid has retired." "Be so good as to answer that, Watson." I placed the journal aside and opened the door. Standing there, outlined in the foggy glow of the street lamp, was a tall man in morning clothes, black coat, black gloves, and a top hat held respectfully in one hand. But what struck me at once, indeed what I could not tear my eyes from, was the curious ring on his left hand. It was a woman's ring. A widow's ring, to be precise. Black enamel encircled a small onyx stone with the initials A.L. worked in gold upon its surface, and this ring, so delicate and unmistakably feminine, adorned the ring finger of a decidedly masculine hand. "Good evening," he said. "I must speak to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It is a matter of urgency, and I fear of some delicacy." "Come in, sir," I replied, stepping aside. "This way, if you please." Holmes glanced up the moment the door closed. His eyes darted immediately to the man's hand. "You are either a devoted husband or a remarkably brazen thief," Holmes said with a smile that hovered somewhere between amused and intrigued. "Either way, you are most welcome. Please sit." The visitor's thin lips twitched slightly. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, I am neither, but I am desperate." He sat at Holmes's invitation, drawing a sealed envelope from within his coat. He handed it to Holmes without another word. Holmes held it to the lamplight before opening it, monogrammed in violet ink, unusual, and scented, though faintly, with violets. "The writer is a woman, well-bred and recently bereaved. I dare say the paper is Italian. Fabriano, am I right?" The visitor blinked. "Yes, how—" "The watermark, of course. Now let us hear what this mysterious lady has to say." Holmes broke the seal with a silver letter opener and read in silence. His brows furrowed gradually as he progressed, until at last he folded the letter and looked up. "You have not yet given us your name." "Edward Chalcombe," the man said quietly. "My father was Sir Giles Chalcombe of Marlow Square." "Indeed," Holmes said. "And you, I take it, are recently returned from the continent?" Mr. Chalcombe looked startled. "Yes, 2 days ago. From Lyon. How could you know that? Your overcoat is French cut, your boots still bear traces of reddish roan clay, and your accent, though faint, is tinged with the inflections of someone who's spent time in France but is not quite at home there. But let us speak of the matter at hand. You are here because of Lady Agatha Lovell." Chalcombe nodded gravely. "She was my cousin." "And she is dead." "Indeed," said Holmes. "Though the death certificate records a simple fall down the staircase of her estate in Surrey, this letter claims she was murdered." "She was," Chalcombe said, "and I believe I know who did it. But I cannot prove it. That is why I have come to you, Mr. Holmes. The man responsible, he wears her ring." There was a silence in the room that could have shattered glass. Holmes leaned forward at last, steepling his fingers again. "A man who wears a widow's ring. Most irregular, and most intriguing." I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as Holmes turned to me with the glint of a hunt in his eyes. "Watson," he said, "we go to Surrey in the morning." The following morning dawned gray and wind-stirred, with veils of mist still clinging to the rooftops of Baker Street as Holmes and I boarded the early train to Surrey. Mr. Edward Chalcombe had departed the evening prior, leaving behind only the letter from Lady Agatha Lovell and a troubling mystery that clung to us like the November fog. Holmes had spoken little after our guest left, save to issue a curt instruction to have our bags ready by dawn. Now, seated across from him in the gently swaying carriage, I studied his face, which bore the sharp, introspective stillness I had come to associate with a mind in fierce activity. He held Lady Lovell's letter in his gloved hands, reading it once more, as if attempting to divine something that had eluded him during the first reading. "Holmes," I ventured at last, "this business of the ring, surely it could have been gifted or taken as a token of grief." Holmes looked up. "A widower may carry a lock of hair or wear a band as remembrance, but to wear a widow's mourning ring, with her initials? On the left hand, no less? No, Watson, this is no symbol of bereavement. It is a symbol of possession, or of defiance. But you think the death truly was no accident?"
Lady Lovell's letter contains no hysteria.
She writes with clarity, with calculation. She names no suspect outright, but she feared someone enough to write that note in secret and send it to Chalcombe in Lyon. A staircase fall in an aging manor is tragic, but not uncommon. But one preceded by a concealed warning? That is not the hand of fate, but of orchestration. I leaned back thinking, and what do we know of this cousin, Edward Chalcombe? His grief seemed genuine, but that proves little. We know only that he wears the air of an honest man. That may be deception or sincerity. I have not yet determined which. What matters is that he is our link to the house where death occurred, and to the man who wears that curious ring. Holmes tapped the window once as if to dismiss the thought. We shall begin at Oakbridge Hall. We arrived at the small station of Godalming shortly before 10. From there, a hired carriage bore us, along a winding country road fringed with skeletal trees and mist-draped hedgerows until we turned onto a gravel lane that led to Oakbridge Hall. The manor rose from the fog like a brooding memory, red-bricked, with ivy crawling over much of the eastern facade. Its gables slouched under the weight of time, and its chimneys, tall and unlit, stood like silent sentinels above a house in mourning. A liveried manservant received us with solemn efficiency and led us through a dim corridor into a drawing room where Edward Chalcombe stood waiting. He had changed from the previous night's black coat into a tweed jacket, though his eyes retained the same restless energy. Another man stood by the hearth, a shorter fellow, square in the shoulders, with hair graying at the temples and a mustache clipped with military precision. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Chalcombe said. "Allow me to introduce Colonel Archibald Radbury, my cousin by marriage and executor of Lady Lovell's estate." Radbury gave us each a firm nod. "Gentlemen, I understand you're here to poke about the old place. I hope you find something, though heaven knows I can't see what." "You were in the house at the time of Lady Lovell's accident?" Holmes asked, taking a seat by the fire. "I was," Radbury said. "So was the housekeeper and two of the maids. Her ladyship had taken to walking after tea each day, always through the portrait gallery and down the east staircase. That afternoon I heard the crash, terrible sound, and found her at the foot of the stairs. Neck broken. Instantaneous, the doctor said. Were there signs of struggle? Displaced rugs? Marks on the banister? None that I saw, Radbury replied. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. And who else was in residence? Her ladyship's companion, Miss Vale, but she was in her rooms with a headache. The butler, Mr. Jessup, had gone into town. Edward here had not yet returned from France. And myself, I had come down for the week to help Lady Lovell prepare her legal affairs. She had no children, you see. Only a string of relatives and cousins. And you are among them, Holmes said mildly. Radbury's brow darkened, but he gave a tight smile. I am, and Edward as well. Though I dare say I have been the more constant presence. Holmes rose. Might we see the scene of the accident? Radbury gestured toward the door. This way. We followed him down a long, carpeted hall adorned with portraits. The air was dry with dust and faintly scented with lavender and age. The gallery opened into a descending staircase, steep with a sharp curve. Holmes crouched at the top, inspecting the banister, the floor, and finally the carpet. He traced his finger along the polished wood, stopping at a faint smudge near the uppermost step. Curious, he murmured. This stair rail was recently cleaned, but not thoroughly. See here. Wax and dust residue wiped unevenly, but with purpose. Someone touched this surface with a gloved hand after polishing. Could have been any servant, Radbury offered, but Holmes ignored him. And here, Watson, observe the angle of descent. If Lady Lovell had stumbled, her body would have come to rest facing the west wall. Yet from the coroner's report, she was found facing east, toward the inner gallery. The trajectory doesn't match a natural fall, I frowned. So you believe she was pushed? I believe her death was not due to clumsiness, Holmes said. Whether it was murder remains to be seen. As we returned to the drawing room, a sharp voice met us. A woman's voice, clipped and cold. You've brought outsiders into the house, Edward? Is this what morning looks like now? The speaker was tall, gaunt, and immaculately dressed in black. Her face bore the traces of once formidable beauty, now rigid with age and suspicion. Miss Henrietta Vale, Chalcombe said quietly. Lady Lovell's companion. She looked Holmes up and down. And who is this man with the stare of a hawk? My name is Sherlock Holmes, madam. Then I presume you've come to tell us what we already know. That death comes for us all, even down staircases. Holmes tilted his head. On the contrary, Miss Vale, I suspect the staircase was merely the messenger. Her expression stiffened. Is that meant to be clever? No, only accurate. She left with a curt nod, her heels clicking sharply down the corridor. Quite the ray of sunshine, I muttered. Holmes turned to Chalcombe. You mentioned last night that the man who now wears Lady Lovell's mourning ring is not a stranger. Do you mean Colonel Radbury? Chalcombe shook his head. No, Colonel Radbury wears only his signet. The man I speak of is a guest who arrived yesterday uninvited. Holmes's eyes narrowed. You failed to mention this last night. I feared you would not come if you thought it nonsense. But I swear to you, Holmes, the man wears Agatha's ring. I saw it with my own eyes. He claims to be an old friend, but none of us have ever heard her speak his name. And what name does he give? Mr. Silas Venn? Holmes turned away, lips tightening ever so slightly. Watson, he said, we are staying the night. I knew then that the true chase had begun. The guest chamber allotted to us was at the far end of the west wing, removed from the bustle of the main household and as silent as a tomb. Holmes seemed to prefer it that way. After a frugal luncheon taken in the drawing room, during which Miss Vale's silence was as pronounced as Colonel Radbury's Scotch, we retired briefly to our room. Holmes stood at the window, staring out over the fog-drenched lawn. The silhouettes of yew trees loomed in the distance like watchful sentries. He had spoken little during the meal, save for one observation about the curious ringlet of hair coiled and pinned beneath Miss Vale's bonnet, a detail I had missed entirely. Her grief is a mask, Watson, he said at last, an emotion worn for propriety's sake. But something else is hidden under it. You suspect her of the murder, of having motive most certainly. Miss Vale's tenure with Lady Lovell was long and well compensated. With Agatha's death, her future is uncertain. But whether that desperation could turn lethal, I cannot say yet. There was a knock at the door. Holmes crossed the room and opened it. A thin young maid, pale and wide-eyed, stood wringing her hands. Begging your pardon, sir, she said. Mr. Chalcombe says you asked to see the ring. Holmes nodded. Yes, is Mr. Venn available? He's in the conservatory, sir, reading. Holmes turned to me with a flicker of interest. Come, Watson. Let us meet the man whose hand carries a widow's final word. We followed the girl through the narrow back corridor, our footsteps muffled on worn rugs. The conservatory opened before us in a soft spill of light and damp air, a glass-ceilinged room fragrant with hothouse orchids and potted ferns. The fog outside dulled the sun to a silvery sheen, lending everything within a strange aquatic glow. There, seated in a wicker chair beside a tall urn of lilies, was a man of no particular age. He could have been 40 or 60. His face was lean and smooth, the skin drawn tightly over fine bones. His eyes were pale, gray, or perhaps a faded blue and too still. His suit was dark, neat, impeccably tailored, and his left hand lay in view upon a book of poetry, the fingers long and ungloved. The ring was unmistakable, black enamel. Gold initials, A.L., Mr. Silas Venn, Holmes said. The man raised his eyes slowly. Indeed. My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. Venn closed his book without haste. Ah, he said, with the vague smile of someone accustomed to being recognized. The great consulting detective. A pleasure. Holmes was already studying him, head slightly tilted, like a falcon appraising its prey. I trust you will pardon the bluntness of my question, Mr. Venn, but may I ask how you came to wear the ring of a deceased widow who by every account did not know you? For a long moment, Ven said nothing. He then looked down at his hand and rotated it slightly. She gave it to me, he said. Holmes blinked. Lady Level? Yes, Agatha. When? Before her death, of course. Holmes's mouth twitched at the corner. And may I ask how you were acquainted with Lady Lovell? Ven looked toward the window. We met many years ago in Italy. She was not yet a widow then. I was unwell. She took pity on me. And yet no one in this house has heard her mention your name. She was discreet. Holmes smiled tightly. Discretion is one thing. Total omission is another. Perhaps it was embarrassment, Ven said lightly. Agatha always feared being thought foolish. Foolish in what regard? Ven stood and approached an orchid, touching a petal as one might stroke a lover's cheek. She once said I reminded her of her first husband. I think she wished to remember without confessing the fact to those who knew only the version of herself she kept here. The version that belonged to propriety and English lawns. Holmes was watching him with rapt attention. And what version did she show you? A truer one, Ven said with the faintest curve of a smile. The one that wore red silk and read Dante aloud on a balcony in Florence. His voice had grown softer, almost wistful. Yet you weren't named in her will. No, Ven said, turning to face us again. She told me she would not do that. It would invite suspicion. But she gave me this ring, a token, a promise. Holmes stepped forward. And you came here after her death to claim... What exactly? Ven met his gaze directly. Only what I was given. Which is a ring of considerable sentimental value and I suspect some monetary one as well. Ven's eyes did not flinch. If it were worth nothing, I would still wear it. Holmes regarded him in silence for a long moment. One final question, Mr. Ven. Where were you on the evening Lady Lovell died? In London. I arrived 2 days ago after I read the notice of her passing. And you can prove this? If the concierge of the hotel I stayed in is reliable, yes. Holmes inclined his head, the faintest trace of amusement glinting in his eyes. Thank you for your time. Good day. As we stepped back into the corridor, I exhaled the breath I had not realized I'd been holding. You don't believe him, I said quietly. Holmes's expression had grown flinty, not a syllable. The man plays a long game, Watson, and he plays it well. There's a gleam in his eye that only comes from the pleasure of having lied effectively. We returned to the West Wing, where Holmes shut the door behind us with more force than necessary. That ring was not gifted, he said. It was taken. From her body? Unclear. But his entire performance, it reeked of invention. He is too smooth, too detached. And yet not devoid of feeling. He wants something more than the ring. More than the ring. Money? Perhaps. But I suspect there's a deeper knot here. Let me show you something. He produced Lady Lovell's letter from his coat pocket and unfolded it on the writing desk. He pointed to the final paragraph. If anything should happen to me, you must know that I tried to stop it. The signs are all there, though hidden. The name he uses is not his own, and what he wears upon his hand was never meant for him. The name he uses? I murmured. Indeed, Holmes said. Silas Ven may not be Silas Ven, and the ring, he wears it not as a mourner but as a trophy, or a key to something Lady Lovell had, or knew. A sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Calcum entered, his face pale. Holmes, he said quickly. I thought you ought to know. Colonel Radbury has locked the family archive. Says it's to prevent disorder during the commotion. He stationed the butler at the door. Holmes's brow lifted. An archive? Yes, an old document room. Family records, estate deeds, private letters. Lady Lovell kept it under lock and key for decades. Radbury insists it's just a precaution, which means it's precisely where we must go, Holmes said. He picked up his coat and turned to me. Watson, tonight we'll learn whether the truth was buried with Lady Lovell or hidden just out of reach. And with that, we slipped once more into the shadows of Oakbridge Hall. Night had settled over Oakbridge Hall like a thick velvet curtain, muffling sound and distorting shadow. From our West Wing chamber, the manor seemed quieter than ever, a silence not of peace but of watchfulness. Somewhere beyond the closed doors and shuttered windows, secrets lay coiled in the dark, waiting for Holmes to draw them into the light. At a little past midnight, Holmes rose from his chair by the hearth and extinguished the lamp. The moon cast a cold silvery glow through the narrow window panes, illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He donned a dark overcoat and slipped a small metal pick and an envelope of fine powders into his inner pocket. "Are you ready, Watson?" he whispered. I nodded, pulling on my boots. "The archive, then?" "Yes, Colonel Radbury may sleep soundly, but his conscience certainly does not. I have no doubt he fears what that room contains." We moved through the corridor with deliberate quiet, Holmes pausing at each corner like a scout in enemy territory. The passage was narrow and lined with faded portraits, half-lit visages of long-dead Calcombs and Lovels. Their painted eyes watched us pass with solemn indifference. The archive was housed behind a stout wooden door in a wing we had not yet seen. A hallway of stone flooring led us there, uncarpeted and echo-prone. Holmes held up a hand as we neared. The butler, Jessup, was stationed outside, slumped in a chair beside the door. His breathing was deep and rhythmic. "Drugged or merely exhausted," Holmes murmured. "No matter. This is our opportunity." He knelt at the lock, a polished brass affair recently oiled. In less than a minute, it clicked open under Holmes's deft fingers. The door creaked softly inward. We stepped into a room that smelled of dust, old paper and something else, lavender, faint but persistent, like the ghost of Lady Lovell herself. Shelves lined the walls, burdened with ledgers, bound correspondence, and yellowing estate records. A roll-top desk stood at the center, its contents still arranged with near-military precision. Holmes did not touch it yet. Instead, he examined the floor. "2 sets of footprints," he whispered. "Recent. See the disturbance in the dust. One set heavy, boots. Likely Radbury. The other, lighter. Could be Miss Vale. They've both been here since the room was locked. Could they be looking for the same thing? Possibly. But I suspect only one of them knows what they're looking for." He turned his attention to the desk. Its drawers were unlocked. Holmes rifled quickly through them. Letters tied in silk ribbons, an envelope marked private, and a curious black-bound notebook with no title on its cover. He opened it slowly. Inside was a list, dozens of names, some crossed out in thick pencil strokes. Beside each name were dates, locations, and what looked like coded annotations. SL 1879, no witness, Burlington final. Holmes flipped through several pages before stopping. "Watson," he said grimly, "this is no ledger. It's a catalog of deaths." I peered over his shoulder. "Lady Lovell kept this?" "Apparently, and I believe she was tracking a pattern. Unsolved deaths among the nobility and upper ranks. Possibly linked? Possibly all pointing to a single individual. Venn." Holmes's face was taut. "If that is his name." He flipped to the final entry. It was incomplete. A name had been written, G. Holloway, but no notes followed. Just a single phrase, "He's close now." "I fear I've waited too long." Holmes stared at the page in silence, then carefully tore it from the book and tucked it into his coat. "We must leave this undisturbed," he whispered. "If Radbury or Venn returns and finds it missing, we lose our advantage." As we turned to go, a sound stopped us, a door, closing. Holmes's eyes met mine. We crept into the corridor, but the hall was now empty. Jessup was still dozing, or pretending to, and the shadows held no other figure. Holmes crouched and examined the dust again. "Third set of prints," he murmured. "Fresh, smaller feet. Slippers, not shoes." Someone else was watching, or listening. We returned to our room in silence, each deep in his own thoughts. Holmes paced for nearly an hour, while I scribbled notes by candlelight. Finally, just as dawn broke, he spoke. "Watson, there is a game at play in Oakbridge Hall, one with long-standing rules and old participants. Lady Lovell, I now believe, was a player who tried too late to shift the outcome." I set down my pen. "And what of Venn?" "He is not merely an opportunist or a former lover. He is an infiltrator, someone who needed to be close to Lady Lovell in her final days. Whether to silence her, extract information, or something else, we will discover. But he is not here for sentiment, and Radbury, a man who stands to gain from silence. He has a military bearing, but the instincts of a politician. He'll keep secrets buried if it suits him." Holmes glanced toward the window. "But someone else is watching. Someone not accounted for, and they've just made their presence known." He tapped the torn page on the desk. "G. Holloway, that name is the key. We must find who he was and why Lady Lovell feared him, or feared for him." At breakfast, we appeared as though nothing had transpired. Venn was absent. Miss Vale entered late and tight-lipped, her spoon trembling slightly as she lifted it to her mouth. Radbury was already seated, flipping through the Times with studied calm. Mr. Holmes, Radbury said smoothly. I trust your night was uneventful. Perfectly so, Holmes replied, buttering his toast, glad to hear it. You'll forgive me for securing the archive room. There have been too many hands stirring about, and I prefer order. Naturally, Holmes said. I quite agree. Chalcom arrived last, a folded note in hand. This came for me just now, he said, brow furrowed. From a stable boy. No name. He passed it to Holmes. Holmes read it once, then passed it to me. The lady knew too much. The ring was not given but earned. He will come again tonight. Do not let him see the journal. Watson, Holmes said softly, there is no longer any doubt. Someone else in this house knows the truth, and they are not on Ven's side. What shall we do? He stood and wiped his fingers delicately with a napkin. We find the journal's hiding place. We follow the night visitor, and above all, we do not let Mr. Silas Ven know that Lady Lovell's words are in our hands. He glanced toward the darkened conservatory, where Ven had appeared the day before like a ghost out of time. Because tonight, Watson, the dead may speak, and when they do, I intend to listen. The remainder of the day passed with a taut stillness, as though the very walls of Oakbridge Hall were holding their breath. Holmes spent most of the afternoon in deliberate observation, drifting from the drawing room to the conservatory, from the garden paths to the back stairs, always with that peculiar air of lazy indifference that masked his fiercest moments of thought. I followed when I could, though he often dismissed me with a wave, preferring solitude when his mind was furiously at work. Shortly before dusk, Holmes and I returned to our chamber. He had obtained a floor plan of the manor from Jessup under the pretense of not getting lost after dinner, and he now unfurled it across the writing desk, flattening the corners with his pipe, pocket watch, a matchbox, and a biscuit tin. There, he said, tapping the northeast quadrant of the drawing. Lady Lovell's private study, distinct from the archive. No one has mentioned it. Curious, don't you think? I wasn't aware she kept one, I replied. Precisely. But if one were to hide a journal of damning import, would one place it among estate records under lock and butler guard? Or in a study one alone possessed and no one else thinks to search? No one else thinks to search. I leaned in, tracing the route from our wing. And the entrance is disguised, he said. Behind the south panel of the music room. There's a passage between the east wing and the chapel stairwell. Miss Vale passes it every evening on her way to prayers. I suspect she knows of it. So we search tonight? No, he said, folding the map. You search. I have an appointment to keep with a ghost. At my startled expression, Holmes gave a rare smile. Forgive the drama, Watson. But the anonymous note said, he will come again tonight. I mean to be waiting when he does. But who is he? Ven? Possibly. Or someone even more elusive. Night came early. The manor dined at 6:30, and though the courses were elaborate, the mood was subdued. Colonel Radbury spoke mostly of politics. Miss Vale was nearly silent, and Edward Chalcom seemed distracted, as though wrestling with something he had not yet found the courage to voice. Mr. Ven was absent once more, his place at the table conspicuously left untouched. After dinner, Holmes excused himself with the claim of an urgent telegram from London, and vanished through the front hall with his hat and coat. I knew better than to question his path. He was laying a trap, and I had a separate task to see through. I waited an hour after his departure, then made my way to the music room. It was unoccupied, lit only by a pair of gas lamps near the pianoforte. The panel Holmes had indicated was cleverly concealed, oak veneer designed to match the rest of the wainscoting, but a subtle groove near the baseboard betrayed it. I pressed lightly, and the panel swung inward with the gentlest creak. The passage beyond was narrow and unlit. I struck a match, shielding it with my hand, and descended a slight slope of stone steps. The air grew colder, tinged with damp and something acrid, ink perhaps, or mildew. At the end of the corridor stood a small wooden door, unmarked. It opened without resistance. The study was modest. Bare floorboards, a small fireplace, and a single writing desk beneath a curtained window. Dust lay thick across the shelves, though one spot on the desk gleamed faintly where a hand had wiped it clean. I lit a nearby oil lamp and began to search. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath a folio of pressed flowers, I found it, a journal, bound in green leather, with the same looping handwriting I had seen in the archive, Lady Agatha Lovell's private thoughts. I opened it with reverence. The early entries were mundane. appointments, household disputes, weather. But as I turned the pages, the tone changed. Names began to appear, all men, all of a certain class, some with annotations I recognized from the black notebook. Seen again in Naples, not his real name. Mask of grief too easily donned. One name recurred with chilling frequency. Silas Venn. He was referred to in many ways, the gentleman with the hollow smile, the one who never truly aged, the guest who always arrives too late. She never accused him outright. But Lady Lovell's words painted a portrait of a man who moved between deaths, between widows, between fortunes, always lingering just long enough to earn trust, sympathy, access. Then vanishing. There were references to aliases, Simon Vey, Victor Nell, even S. Verne. She had traced him across Europe. Each time a bereaved woman. Each time some minor inheritance changed hands. Never enough to provoke scandal. Always just below the threshold of suspicion, and then one final entry barely a day before her death. He has found me again. He comes not as a thief, but as an echo of love. I let him in. The ring is gone. I froze. She had seen him. She had let him in. But the ring had not been gifted. It had been taken. Perhaps while she slept, or while she trusted him still. I closed the journal with trembling hands and slipped it into my coat. As I extinguished the lamp and crept back down the corridor, I heard a sound that made my heart jolt. A floorboard creaked. Not my own. I pressed back into the shadows just as a figure passed the mouth of the corridor. Slim, moving quickly. A woman? Miss Vale. She paused near the panel, then pressed it gently closed behind her, not knowing I was still within. Why had she come? Had she seen Holmes return? Had she come looking for the journal? I waited several minutes before emerging, then made my way silently back to our chamber. Holmes arrived shortly before midnight, covered in mud and smelling faintly of chimney soot. I spent 2 hours crouched behind a hedgerow, he said briskly, but it paid off. Our ghost returned. Venn? No, a maid, young. The same who brought us to Venn in the conservatory. Her name is Elsie Markham. What was she doing? Delivering another note. This time to the butler. He held up a small folded paper, retrieved presumably after the butler retired. It read, "He knows. Burn the black book tonight. They cannot be allowed to find it." I showed Holmes the journal, and his eyes lit with something between triumph and cold satisfaction. Well done, Watson. This is the keystone. I told him about Miss Vale, her appearance near the hidden passage, her evident knowledge of it. Holmes nodded. She may be more than she seems, but I no longer believe she is the hand behind the death. She is frightened, yes, but not murderous. And Venn, Holmes's mouth curled. Venn is a serpent that sheds skins freely, but I now know how to pin him in place. Tomorrow we turn the house against him. How? We arrange a gathering. Everyone in one room. Then we show them a truth that not even Venn can slip free from. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, and looked out the window into the night beyond. This house has harbored a spider for too long, Watson. In the morning we break the web. The following morning dawned clear and cold, with a pale sun glancing across the frost-rimed grounds of Oakbridge Hall. The air inside the manor was tight with tension, as if every ticking clock and creaking floorboard were aware of what was coming. Holmes, ever precise, had already spoken with Edward Chalcombe at first light. They had conferred in low tones in the corridor outside our chamber, and when Holmes returned, there was a new sharpness to his movements, a predator's focus. Today, he said without preamble, we stage the confrontation. But not as a direct accusation, not yet. First we expose the man's pattern, then we make him speak. Shall I bring the journal? No, that remains hidden until the precise moment it's needed. Too much truth unveiled at once, Watson, can give a liar something to wriggle against. First, we must soften the ground beneath him. After breakfast, during which Venn reappeared, calm and unreadable as ever, Chalcombe discreetly invited the principal members of the household to assemble in the morning room at 11 o'clock. The invitation was couched in polite terms. Mr. Holmes wished to share some observations regarding Lady Lovell's unfortunate accident, and had requested the presence of those nearest to her in her final days. Colonel Radbury arrived promptly, his mustache bristling and his eyes sharp with restrained suspicion. Miss Vale followed soon after, her expression carefully neutral. Venn entered last, offering Holmes a thin smile as he took a chair by the fireplace. Jessup the butler stood discreetly by the door, while Calcum remained at Holmes's side. Holmes waited until the door was closed and the room had settled into silence. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "You are here because the death of Lady Agatha Lovell, though officially recorded as an accident, contains details which suggest otherwise." Miss Vale stiffened. Radbury leaned forward. Venn merely blinked. Holmes continued, tone crisp and unhurried. "I have studied the site of her fall. The position of the body, the handprint on the banister, and the recent polishing, done with too much haste, indicate tampering. She did not fall naturally. She was pushed. There was a collective intake of breath, though no one spoke. Furthermore," Holmes went on, "Lady Lovell, prior to her death, wrote a letter to her cousin, Mr. Chalcombe, warning that she feared for her life. In that letter, she referenced a man who was not what he claimed to be, and noted that a ring had gone missing, one which later appeared on the finger of Mr. Silas Venn." All heads turned to Venn. Still, he did not flinch. "That is quite an accusation." "Mr. Holmes," he said softly. "I am not accusing," Holmes replied. "I am illuminating. The accusation will either condemn or acquit itself." Holmes turned to the others. "Mr. Venn claims to have known Lady Lovell for many years, and yet no member of this household had heard his name prior to his arrival. He claims she gave him her mourning ring, a deeply intimate token, despite no record of this gift, nor any mention of him in her correspondence. He claims to have been away during her death, but has provided no witness or written proof. Purely circumstantial," Radbury muttered. "Indeed," Holmes said, "which is why I did not rest on that alone. I conducted further inquiries." He paced slowly before the hearth. "In my investigations, I have uncovered records of a man using the name Silas Venn, among others, who has appeared at the periphery of no fewer than 5 wealthy widows in the past 20 years. Each time he became acquainted with them under the guise of distant affection or shared grief. And each time, shortly after his appearance, the lady in question either died unexpectedly or changed her will. In no case did the man remain to collect the spoils. He simply vanished." Now even Radbury looked unsettled. Holmes stopped before Venn. "You may have gone by other names, Simon Vey, S. Verne, perhaps even Holloway, but you have left a pattern behind you. You're a parasite, Mr. Venn, feeding on loneliness and mourning." Venn tilted his head slightly, his pale eyes unblinking. "What extraordinary imagination, Mr. Holmes. Do you mean to suggest I am some sort of serial fraud? A black widower? I suggest," Holmes said, "that your presence here is no accident. You returned to Oakbridge not to grieve, but to confirm that what Lady Lovell knew had died with her. You did not expect her to leave evidence, but she did." Venn's facade began to crack, barely perceptibly, a tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. "Even if such a journal existed," he said, "it would be hearsay. Delirious imaginings of a woman on the edge?" "She was not delirious," Miss Vale said quietly. All heads turned. Miss Vale sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. Her voice, though brittle, was steady. "I saw him with her, the night before she died. She was confused, yes, but not mad. She told me she had finally understood who he truly was. She begged me to make sure no one entered the study." Venn laughed softly. "And yet here we are." "She was afraid," Miss Vale went on, louder now. "She said he had worn many faces, that his kindness was always borrowed, that he would leave again once he had what he came for." "Which was?" Holmes asked. "The ring," she said. "And something more. A document." Venn stood. "I will not sit here while you assassinate my character with fantasies and gossip. If you wish to call the police, by all means, do so. But unless you have proof, real proof, this is slander." Holmes gave a slight bow. "I agree. Which is why I now invite you all to follow me. The proof awaits." The group moved in tense silence as Holmes led us back through the manor and into the music room. With deliberate motion, he pressed the hidden panel. Gasps echoed behind us as the narrow corridor revealed itself. At the end of the passage, the study stood waiting. Holmes entered and gestured to the desk. From within a concealed cavity beneath the bottom drawer, he withdrew the journal and opened it to the final entries. He read aloud. "He has found me again. He comes not as a thief, but as an echo of love. I let him in. The ring is gone." He turned the book so all could see the name inscribed at the top of the page, Silas Venn. You did not expect her to write this, Holmes said. And now you know she did. Ven's hands tightened into fists. There is no proof I killed her, he hissed. No. But there is proof you were here that night, Holmes said. A stable boy saw a man matching your description enter the grounds through the east gate after midnight. You were not in London. You came to Oakbridge under cover of darkness as you've done before. You thought the ring would give you leverage. Instead, it tied you to the crime. Ven made a sudden movement, toward the study door, toward flight, but Chalcombe and Radbury were already blocking the exit. Jessup appeared behind them, summoned by Holmes earlier that morning, and held firm. Mr. Ven, Holmes said coldly, you are not a grieving friend. You are a professional deceiver. And now you are a cornered one. Ven's eyes darted about. But the web had closed. Radbury turned to Holmes, stunned. How many others has he done this to? I suspect more than we yet know, Holmes replied. But this time he stayed too long. A long silence passed, then slowly Ven sat down. His face had gone ashen, and for the first time the mask fell away. He looked smaller, older, tired, the kind of tired that only comes when the game is finally lost. Later, Scotland Yard would be summoned and the journal authenticated. But for now, the house stood still around him, as if Oakbridge Hall itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. Holmes looked at me and his voice was soft. Lady Lovell tried to warn us. It took her death to make us listen. The house did not relax even after Ven's capture. Oakbridge Hall remained taut, as if unsure whether it could trust the silence that followed. The corridors echoed less, and the wind tapping at the stained glass windows of the east wing sounded, in that strange way of old places, like whispers that had gone unanswered for too long. Scotland Yard arrived the next morning. Inspector Collier, a clean-shaven and humorless man from the Surrey Division, took our statements with the professional irritation of one whose jurisdiction had been usurped by a consulting detective. He examined the journal with reluctant admiration, spoke briefly with Ven, who had grown silent and withdrawn in his locked room, and took the man into custody without resistance. The ring was recovered from his hand, surrendered quietly as if it no longer had meaning now that its usefulness had expired. Once the police carriage departed down the gravel drive, stirring long plumes of dust behind it, Holmes and I remained at the window of the drawing room. Outside, Chalcombe stood alone on the lawn, his hands in his pockets, staring at the frost-covered garden beds where Lady Lovell had once walked each morning with her parasol and gloves, whispering instructions to her housekeeper about begonias and lavender. Holmes turned from the window at last. It is done, Watson. I sat by the fire, the final page of Lady Lovell's journal open on my lap. Not quite. There are still questions. True, Holmes said, moving to stand beside the hearth. But not all questions deserve answers. Some deserve only silence. I looked up sharply. You know something more. Something you've not said. He didn't deny it. I do. Then out with it, man. We've come this far together. He gave a small sigh. Not of reluctance, but of resignation, as one might release a bird from a cage, knowing it can never be caught again. There is a missing name, Watson. One not recorded in the journal, but implied in the silences between Lady Lovell's entries. Do you recall the final entry mentioning someone called G. Holloway? Of course, Gregory Holloway, Holmes said.
He died in Venice.
Drowned under mysterious circumstances. His widow, Eleanor, claimed it was an accident. He'd fallen from a gondola during a late-night argument with the gondolier. No charges were ever brought. Eleanor Holloway vanished 6 weeks later. But what makes it interesting is that a man matching Ven's description was seen in Venice at the same time, under the name Sebastian Vale. Vale? I repeated. Like Henrietta Vale? Indeed. Not a coincidence, I stared at him. Are you saying Miss Vale is his sister? Holmes said quietly. Or so the trail suggests. They were born to the same mother, but under different fathers. She changed her name to match Lady Lovell's. Easier to gain trust as a companion, perhaps. Or perhaps she simply wished to distance herself from her brother's trail. She warned us, I murmured. She did, Holmes said, not out of guilt but out of survival. I believe she feared she might be his next convenience. It is one thing to serve as a spy, quite another to witness the moment the spider chooses to devour rather than manipulate. We sat in silence for a while. The fire cracked. Holmes lit a cigarette and smoked in slow, thoughtful puffs. At last I said, "What will you do with the information?" "Nothing," he replied. "The case is solved. Ven is in custody. And Miss Vale, if that is indeed her true name, is no longer a danger. She has lost her leverage. I believe she intends to disappear again as quietly as she arrived." That afternoon the household began to dissolve. Colonel Radbury left first, citing duties in London. Miss Vale took her leave shortly after, packing her single case and slipping away without farewells. Calcum remained, though he seemed adrift within the walls of Oakbridge, uncertain of what future awaited him in the shadow of the past. It was only in the evening, as the sun cast golden bars across the wooden floors, that Calcum joined us by the fire. "She knew," he said suddenly, not looking at either of us. "Agatha knew what would happen. She saw him coming." Holmes nodded. "She knew, but she misjudged how long she had to act. Fear delayed her hand, and fear more often than not is the accomplice of evil. She gave him the ring once," Calcum said, "years ago. That much she told me when I asked her about it once years before. She said it was returned to her under strange circumstances and she swore never to wear it again. She locked it away, yet he took it once more," I said. "A symbol reclaimed, as if nothing could stay beyond his reach." "Nothing had," Holmes replied, "until now." Calcum stood. "I'm having the archive sealed, and her study preserved as she left it. It seems wrong to erase her entirely." "You are wise to do so," Holmes said. "Some ghosts are best remembered on their own terms." When he left, Holmes turned to me. "Do you see now, Watson? The perfect mask, the grieving friend. He never married, never stayed. Always the visitor, the confidant, the harmless shadow. And behind that shadow, vacancies, widows, and wealth transferred like coins passed beneath a tavern table. But the law has him now. For one death, yes," Holmes said. "Perhaps two if Scotland Yard can unravel more. But his ledger is long, and most of the entries will never speak." I closed the journal and watched the light fade from the windows. We departed Oakbridge Hall the next morning. Holmes said nothing during the train ride back to London, save for one cryptic remark as the city's smoky spires appeared beyond the carriage window. "Do you recall, Watson," he said, "what Lady Lovell wrote in that final entry? He comes not as a thief but as an echo of love." "Yes," I replied. "Then remember this. The most dangerous man in the world is not the one who strikes with fury, but the one who walks behind you with flowers and silence." I made a note of that, as I did all things he said that bore the chill of truth. As we stepped off the platform at Paddington and melted into the crowd, I could not help but glance behind us. But there was no echo, no shadow, only the press of London life returning to its ceaseless rhythm. The case of the man who wore a widow's ring was closed, and yet somewhere in that final turn of the key, I felt the weight of every silent room he had ever left behind. Holmes, for his part, was already thinking of the next case. The following days in Baker Street passed in a strange quietness, not of inactivity but of reflection. Holmes, though outwardly composed, was more contemplative than usual. He neither reached for his violin nor demanded his chemical apparatus, and the morning papers, usually devoured over coffee, were now left unread on the table. I knew the signs well. He was reviewing the case in his mind, testing its edges, not for faults in logic but for echoes of something unresolved. On the third day after our return from Oakbridge Hall, as I returned from my rounds at Queen Charlotte's Hospital, I found Holmes seated in his usual armchair, legs crossed, fingers steepled. Eyes half-lidded in thought. Without looking up, he said, "You saw the notice, Watson?" I hung my coat. "What notice?" He gestured to the Times folded neatly beside the teapot. I picked it up and turned to the Society page, where a short but elegantly phrased announcement caught my eye. "Miss Henrietta Vale has departed England for the Continent." Her destination was not disclosed. "She leaves behind no estate and no forwarding address." I read it twice, then looked up. "She ran. She survived," Holmes corrected. "You believe she feared Ven's allies?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that there may yet be other hands in that long chain of widowhood, hands we did not see, faces hidden in shadows he did not cast alone. Ven's methodology was too clean, too practiced. A man alone may deceive a few, but a man with help, coordinated, selective, can span decades without a whisper. A conspiracy?" Holmes frowned. "A syndicate, perhaps, small, selective, preying on particular victims. Widows with wealth and limited family ties. The grief-stricken, the vulnerable. It would explain the breadth of his travels and the consistency of the pattern. I sat down, the weariness of the hospital replaced by a chill curiosity. Why didn't you pursue it? He raised an eyebrow. Would it have served justice? Or fed my vanity? No, Watson. Let the net tighten where it may. Scotland Yard has the scent now. I've delivered them the thread. They must do the weaving. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. The sort of gray drizzle that turns London streets into mirrors of smoke and coal. I thought of Lady Lovell, of her sharp pen, her careful ledger of names, and her final resolve to write the truth when silence would no longer protect her. Holmes stirred at last. There was something poetic about her resistance. She fought not with confrontation, but with record. She documented him. She named his trail. She didn't confront him at the door. She opened it and handed him the ink-stained blade of his undoing. She died for it, I said. Holmes gave a rare, almost mournful nod, and ensured he would never wear another ring again. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a small silver tray. For you, Mr. Holmes came just a minute ago. He took it, thanked her, and read it without haste. Then he passed it silently to me. From Inspector Collier, stop further evidence uncovered at Venice property. Stop documents. Tied to suspect using name Svern. Stop requesting your assistance on site. Stop urgent. Stop, I looked up. Venice, Holmes said, rising and already reaching for his coat. The city of masks. You're going? Of course. You saw what we saw, Watson. What we didn't see may be even more important. He began gathering his things with swift efficiency, pausing only to tuck his tobacco pouch into the inner lining of his coat. What will you be looking for? I asked, following suit. Evidence of his network, Holmes said. Names, perhaps, patterns, the infrastructure of predation. No spider weaves such a web without threads connecting distant corners. We arrived in Venice 2 days later. The air was thick with salt and history, the canals swollen with the slow tide of centuries. Inspector Collier met us at a modest palazzo tucked along a lesser-known canal, once rented under the name S. Verne. It was a small, decaying villa with shuttered windows and a neglected charm. He used it as a staging point, Collier said, as he led us through. Several belongings were recovered. Letters, ledgers, an address book. But there's something more. Holmes moved through the space with surgical precision. The villa was quiet, emptied, but not lifeless. One room in particular, a study of sorts, bore the marks of meticulous activity. Shelves lined with books in various languages. A writing desk with faded indentations where papers had once rested. A mirror on the wall, but no glass. A hidden compartment lay behind it, recently opened. From within it, Collier drew a folder. Holmes opened it and carefully laid its contents on the desk. Photographs. Grainy, some damaged but unmistakably portraiture. Women, most of them older, some widowed, some unknown. Below each was a name, a code, a date. Among them, Agatha Lovell, Eleanor Holloway, Beatrice Vernham. Some entries were marked with a black line. Others with a red X targets? I asked softly. Holmes nodded. More than that. A ledger of harvests. These are not crimes of opportunity. This was planned, studied. He, or they, watched them, studied them, learned their routines. And struck. Collier stepped forward. There are letters in the same handwriting, signed with an initial M. None from Venn himself. Which means, Holmes said darkly, he wasn't the architect. He was the instrument. He turned to us. This syndicate, if that's what it is, doesn't end with Venn. It merely begins there. We remained in Venice for another day, studying the material, gathering names, locations, and connections. Holmes rarely spoke except to dictate notations for Collier. At night he stood on the villa's balcony, looking out over the dark water, the lamps of gondolas flickering like will-o'-the-wisps across the canals. Before we departed, I asked him, will this ever truly end? He lit a cigarette and leaned on the balcony rail. Not in the way you mean. Evil like this doesn't die with an arrest. It retreats, waits, reinvents itself. But each time it does, we make the world a little smaller for it. That's our only reward. And Miss Vale? Holmes exhaled. She will vanish again, unless we find her first, or unless someone else already has. We returned to Baker Street with folders, copies, and a mystery that had grown far beyond the death of a widow on a staircase. It was no longer the tale of a ring or a deceitful man. It was a tapestry, a deliberate, cruel tapestry of manipulation, forged by minds who saw mourning as opportunity. Holmes filed the documents carefully, his fingers lingering on the name of one woman, Beatrice Vernham. "She died in Zurich," he said softly. 3 years ago. The death was ruled natural. "But you doubt that," I said. "But you doubt that," I said. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the window and said, "Watson, we are not done. This is not the end of a case. It is the beginning of a campaign." The fire crackled behind him. The rain struck the glass, and I knew he was right. There would be others. Other houses. Other names. Other rings. But this time they would not be unchallenged, because Sherlock Holmes had seen the pattern. And Sherlock Holmes never forgets. The days that followed our return from Venice were consumed in a sort of calculated stillness, an intermission between battles. Holmes had gathered enough to convince Scotland Yard of a wider operation behind Silas Venn's crimes, but without further evidence or a clear identity behind the mysterious M, who had authored several of the villa's cryptic instructions. The trail once again grew cold, yet Holmes did not idle. If anything, his mind moved with greater speed, fed now by righteous determination rather than curiosity alone. He kept to the flat, emerging rarely except to visit the British Museum archives or take discreet meetings at unnamed offices across London. On more than one occasion I came home to find unfamiliar cigar ash in the sitting room ashtray, or the scent of perfume lingering, where no lady had visited. "Informants," he explained curtly, when I pressed him. "The kind one pays not in shillings but in immunity." Despite his reticence, I knew he was close to something. He had entered what I often called his high silence, a period of abstraction where all his energy tunneled into mental assembly. He barely ate. He slept sporadically, and his only true conversation came late at night with me, by the fire. It was during one of these evenings, as the rain drummed steadily against the window panes and the fire crackled low, that he finally spoke of the pattern. They were all approached in different ways, Holmes said, eyes fixed on the flames, some through charities, others through art, language, or spiritualist societies. But the result was the same: trust, isolation, inheritance, and then death. You're saying they adapted each approach to the individual widow? Precisely. Which requires planning, research, psychological profiling long before the term existed. This was not opportunistic crime, Watson. It was industrial. Venn was merely the face, the smiling man with the widow's ring. But behind him was a machine, and this M, a mastermind, Holmes said. Or perhaps simply a broker, a facilitator. The name appears frequently in the Venice papers, always at the bottom, always paired with an initial, never a full name, never a location. But I believe, he paused, staring into the fire, I believe M is not a man. I turned. Not a man? No, a woman. Possibly a widow herself. One who understood the grief of others intimately, who knew how to manipulate those bonds because she had once worn them herself. I blinked. You're basing this on what? Holmes smiled faintly. The language of the letters. The syntax is feminine. The metaphors are domestic. References to garden paths, silk hems, fading music. A man writing under a false hand would be clumsy. These were not. These were natural. He stood and crossed to the bookshelf, retrieving the folder of documents recovered from Venice. From within, he withdrew a letter written on lavender paper with neat slanting script. She writes, he read aloud. He must not linger too long. Widowhood is most fertile in its first season. After that they begin to see again. And we are not in the business of light, only shadow. He looked at me. Tell me that is not the voice of someone who has been there. I said nothing. Venn was the executioner, Holmes continued, but M was the priestess. She chose. She prepared. And I believe she is still choosing now. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes read it, and his expression shifted instantly from contemplative to razor-sharp. Watson, pack a bag. We're going to Devonshire. Another widow? No, Holmes said. A survivor. The train to Devon took us through grey fields and rising moorland into a countryside that felt older than London, more secretive. We arrived in the small village of Ashcombe-in-the-Fern just after nightfall. The telegram had come from a solicitor named Blythe, who represented a woman once known as Mrs. Alice Vernon, a name Holmes had noticed in the Venice papers, marked with an asterisk and a question mark. "She's not dead," Holmes said, "at least not yet." Blythe's carriage took us from the station to a cottage perched on a hill, modest but well kept. Blythe, a narrow man with a waxed mustache and sharp eyes, met us at the door. "She won't speak to me," he said, "barely to anyone. But she agreed to see you when I told her who you were." We were led to a small sitting room where the only light came from a lamp on a low table. There, seated by the hearth, was a woman of perhaps 60 years, her once red hair streaked with silver, her eyes watchful but haunted. Holmes stepped forward and bowed slightly. "Mrs. Vernon?" "I was," she said. "Now I am simply Alice." He took a seat opposite her. "You knew him, Ven?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, though that wasn't the name he used with me." "What did he call himself?" "Stephen Vale." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "He came through Exeter," she continued. "Said he was a friend of my late husband's, knew about his time in India. Used the same phrases John did. Even remembered our dog's name. I trusted him." "You let him in?" Holmes said softly. "For 2 months," she whispered. "He stayed in the guest room. Wrote letters. Helped me with the accounts. He never asked for anything. Just listened, and then, one morning he was gone. And so was the copy of my late husband's will. A week later, my bank called. There had been an attempt to access my accounts with a forged power of attorney. But it failed. Yes, because I'd moved the funds a month earlier. Something in me doubted him. Not enough to accuse, just enough to protect myself." Holmes leaned forward. "Mrs. Vernon, do you recall anyone else he corresponded with?" "Letters received?" She hesitated. "Yes, a woman. The letters were always in mauve envelopes. He'd read them and then burned them. But I saw the name once. On the return address. What was it?" Holmes asked sharply. Alice closed her eyes. "It said M. Loring, from Oxford." Holmes stood slowly. "Thank you, madam. You may have just named the spider in the center of the web." We returned to the village inn in silence. Holmes sat at the window, staring into the darkness beyond the hedgerows. Then he said, "Watson, we have our quarry, Monsieur Loring. A name, a place, a pattern. This woman did not disappear with Ven's capture. She will find another hand to wear the next widow's ring." "And what will you do?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes cold with focus. "I will find her." There was no fire that night in the hearth, but Holmes did not seem to feel the cold. The night passed in silence, but in his mind, I knew the pieces were aligning. We were no longer hunting a man. We were hunting the mind that had created him. We returned to London the next day beneath a sky bruised with clouds. Holmes remained silent during the journey, his gaze fixed not on the landscape streaming past the window, but on the possibilities unfolding in his mind. He sat motionless for most of the trip, only once pulling from his coat pocket a small envelope of lavender-hued stationery. It was a scrap Mrs. Vernon had saved. No writing, just the distinctive scent and paper that had haunted her dreams. "Monsieur Loring," he said at last, as if tasting the name. "Oxford," she said. "That is our next move." "Do you believe it's genuine?" I asked. "The return address? Possibly. Or possibly not. But if one weaver of lies grows too clever, they often forget the details they reuse. A name and address, they can become habits." As soon as we arrived at Baker Street, Holmes dispatched 2 telegrams, one to the Oxford Registrar of Residences, the other to a private contact within the General Post Office, requesting any information on a mailing route associated with the name M. Loring. "While we wait," he said, "we must prepare for the inevitable. She knows we are coming." That evening brought only partial answers. The registrar replied first. No record of permanent resident under M. Loring at provided address. Premises registered as short-let lodging under name Mabel Lockridge. Lease paid in cash. No forwarding information. Holmes smiled grimly. She used the name for mail, not for life. She vanishes between the cracks, changing names like Ven changed accents. The second reply came at midnight. A note slipped into our letterbox by a discreet runner, marked confidential. It contained one line: "Outgoing mail from M. Loring sent weekly from Walton Lane Sub-Office, Oxford. Last known drop, 4 days ago." "She's still active," Holmes said. which means we are not chasing a ghost. Early the next morning, we set off for Oxford. The train carried us through a landscape growing steadily colder, the air sharpened by oncoming winter. By mid-morning, we arrived at the ancient university city, where narrow lanes bent like riddles between buildings of stone and spire. Walton Lane's sub-office was a modest brick structure tucked behind a milliner's shop. The clerk, a stooped man with uncertain eyesight, confirmed that a woman matching our description, older, modestly dressed, with gloves and veil, had indeed visited the postbox every Wednesday for several months. She never entered the shop, he said, only posted from the street. Always at the same hour, 11 precisely. Was she here this week? Holmes asked. The clerk nodded. Wednesday morning. Didn't speak. Holmes glanced at me. She doesn't know yet. We scouted the adjacent buildings. A narrow lodging house sat 3 doors down, quiet, clean, respectable. Holmes spoke briefly with the housekeeper, who confirmed a Miss Loring had let a second-floor room for short periods over the past year. A reader, she said. Always had books. Always paid in advance. Never gave trouble. But the room was now vacant. The key returned. The bed untouched. She's moved again, Holmes muttered, just before we arrived. A creature of instinct, she may have sensed the walls closing. As we stepped out onto the street, I caught sight of a figure slipping into the alley behind the building. A woman, slender, wearing a gray cloak and a brimmed hat. Holmes, there, I cried. He spun immediately and took off down the alley, coat flaring like a banner. I followed, our boots slapping the cold stone, but the alley was empty. No woman, no sound. Only the whispering wind and the smell of damp stone. He stopped, chest rising with effort, eyes scanning every doorway. She saw us, he said. Was it her? I can't be certain, but I believe so. We searched the neighborhood for nearly an hour, but she was gone. Like then before her, she had vanished into air. That evening, back in our Baker Street sitting room, Holmes paced while I transcribed notes from the journal. He finally said, She'll vanish again. She has money, methods, but she'll need new faces to act in her place. If we find the pattern of recruitment, we find her. I tapped the desk. What of the code in the Venice book, the notations beside each woman's name? Holmes turned sharply. Yes, the annotations. Many marked with initials, others with a letter and numeral. Some marked with F1, F2, others with symbols. He seized the ledger and laid it on the table. F1 first field? First filter? No, too vague. He flipped to Lady Lovell's entry. Marked F3 confirmed. Letter sent. Ring prepared, then. Holloway. F2. Tracking continues. Clay advised, his brow furrowed. They were stages. A process. First contact, assessment, infiltration, extraction. He turned to the final page. There, under a name we had not noticed before, was a single line. T. Wetherell. F1. Widow at Cheltenham. Viable if Vernham fails. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A fallback. A new target, I said quietly. She has already prepared the next move. He looked at me. We go to Cheltenham. Cheltenham lay under a thin veil of frost as we arrived 2 days later. Holmes had already dispatched an urgent wire to Inspector Collier, requesting surveillance of a property known to have been previously associated with Monsieur Lockridge. At the address in question, a tall house nestled off Montpellier Walk, we found a woman alone, sipping tea in a well-tended parlor, Mrs. Teresa Wetherell, a recent widow, 49, no children, substantial inheritance from a husband in shipping. She received us with confusion, but no suspicion. Holmes introduced himself as a solicitor from London, part of a quiet investigation into financial irregularities associated with her late husband's will. Nothing to concern you, madam, he said. Only a question or two. Have you had visitors recently? She nodded. A very kind woman. Said she ran a trust for war widows. Invited me to a luncheon. What was her name? Miss Maria Linton. From Oxford, I think. Holmes looked up. Did she leave anything? A card, a pamphlet? Yes, I have it here. She retrieved it from a side table. A card embossed in gold with a crest we had seen before. A serpent coiled around a ring. She left it yesterday, Mrs. Wetherell said. Is something the matter? Holmes smiled gently. Not at all. You've done precisely the right thing, and I suspect you've just helped prevent a great many wrongs. We left her safe and untouched. The trap had been baited but not yet sprung. Outside, Holmes stood on the pavement, coat drawn tight, eyes fierce. "She's close, Watson. Too close. But for the first time we are one step ahead." He turned to me. "She is still moving, still choosing, still praying. But we now hold her map, and I do not intend to let her vanish again." He walked into the falling dusk, the wind picking up behind him, and I followed. Knowing the end of the case was no longer simply justice for the past. It was a warning to the future. It was 3 weeks later, deep into the gray bite of December, when the final thread snapped. Holmes and I were seated in the study of a borrowed flat in Cheltenham, anonymous lodging secured at Holmes's request, overlooking the street where Mrs. Teresa Wetherell resided. Scotland Yard had positioned discreet surveillance on the home, but our own eyes were the most vigilant. Each morning, Holmes would study the street with binoculars, awaiting movement. Each evening we compared reports with Inspector Collier's men, watching for a pattern to emerge. Then, on a still, cold morning, as frost glimmered like sugar across the window panes, it happened. "She's here," Holmes murmured. I joined him at the window. A woman in dove gray stepped out of a hired carriage, modest, well-appointed, unremarkable. A wide-brimmed hat shielded most of her face, but Holmes saw through it at once. "That is not Miss Maria Linton," he said. "That is Monsieur Loring, and she's come to confirm the final move." She approached Mrs. Wetherell's door, pausing only a moment before knocking. Holmes was already halfway to the door. "This is it, Watson." We descended the stairs in haste and crossed the road with the efficiency of soldiers on campaign. Holmes gave a sharp knock on Mrs. Wetherell's door, just as it was being opened from within. "M." Loring turned, startled, the edges of her smile still curling. She had been laughing, I think, in that effortless, unthreatening way that disarms so many. But the laugh froze on her lips when she saw Holmes. "Maria Linton, I presume," Holmes said coolly. She recovered quickly. "I'm sorry, is there some mistake?" "No mistake. Merely the end of a long deception." He turned to Mrs. Wetherell. "Madam, you are in danger. This woman is not here on behalf of a charity. She is a predator who orchestrates the theft and often the murder of women like yourself. Widows, alone, vulnerable. I regret to say you have been targeted. Mrs. Wetherell's face went white. "I don't know what you mean," Loring said. Stepping back, Holmes produced a single calling card, the one left in Venice, the serpent coiled around a mourning ring. She used this in Venice, Florence, and now Cheltenham. In each case, the result was the same: financial manipulation, and in some, death. "I'll need you to come with us," Inspector Collier said, stepping from the hedge where he and 2 officers had been waiting on Holmes's signal. The woman's lips parted to speak, but no sound came. The silence stretched. Holmes stepped closer. "You once wrote, 'We are not in the business of light, only shadow,' but you miscalculated. Eventually, someone turns toward the light." Her eyes narrowed. The smile fell away and something cold settled in its place. "You're very clever, Mr. Holmes," she said. "I do try," he replied. She did not resist as she was escorted to the police wagon, nor did she speak again, though I believe she knew, as we all did, that the web had collapsed. And not just hers, but the one she had built through proxies, aliases, and letters. Later, in her rooms at the boarding house, we found the final evidence: detailed dossiers on 7 women, letters coded in the same script found in Venice, and a second ledger, this one older, written in a firmer hand. It was not her own writing. Holmes studied it for a long time. "Not hers," he said. "Someone taught her. This began before her." "A legacy?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "And she carried it further than he ever did. The serpent has more than one head, still." The arrests followed swiftly. Former accomplices in France and Milan, a solicitor in Edinburgh who had forged power of attorney papers, and a nurse in Lyon who had falsified death certificates. One by one, the network fell apart, a house of cards at last exposed to wind. We returned to Baker Street on a cold afternoon in late December. The lamplighters moved like ghosts down the streets. The fireplace in our rooms had been freshly stoked by Mrs. Hudson, and the faint scent of pine from her wreath filled the air. Holmes removed his overcoat and sat without speaking for several minutes. "At last," he said, "you realize, Watson, that we were not chasing a murderer in the beginning. We were chasing a ring, The one on Ven's hand, I said. He nodded. A symbol. A possession. But more than that, it was a cipher. A message that only the dead could read, and only the living could misunderstand. And Lady Lovell? She understood too late. But she made sure someone else would follow the trail. That journal was her final move and her most brilliant. She wrote the story that condemned them, I said. Holmes stood and crossed to the window. It's over for now, but there will be others. Predators always circle where grief leaves gaps. He paused, then added quietly, but I believe we've made the circle smaller. The clock chimed 6. Outside, bells rang faintly from St. Bride's. London bustled on as though it had not just been saved from the shadows. Holmes turned from the window. Come, Watson, he said. Enough ghosts. I believe Mrs. Hudson has made a pudding, and I've earned a sliver of it. I followed him to the fire, knowing that though the darkness might always return, it would never again find the world as silent as before. Not while Sherlock Holmes watched. Not while he listened for the sound of the widow's ring.